The sharp, percussive cracks ripped through the otherwise placid Saturday afternoon, followed by a child's scream, a raw, terrified sound that sliced directly into Marcus Thorne's core. He was on his sister Clara's deck, nursing a lukewarm lemonade, trying to unwind from a week that had involved dissecting a particularly nasty online radicalization network. The suburban tranquility of Meadowbrook Creek was supposed to be his antidote to the darkness he waded through daily. Clearly, the darkness had other plans. He was moving before he consciously registered the decision, his body reacting with the ingrained urgency of years spent confronting imminent threats. He vaulted the low deck railing, landing lightly on the grass, his eyes scanning, assessing. The source of the commotion was just 2 houses down in the Callahan's front yard. Young Leo Callahan, a bright, inquisitive boy of about 8, who used a vibrant blue wheelchair, was the epicenter. And standing over him, a look of venomous triumph twisting her features, was Brenda Hatcher, a woman whose reputation for unpleasantness was already legendary in the short time Marcus had been visiting. In her hand, she held a still-smoking punk, the kind used to light fireworks. More fireworks, a lurid green and red pack of dragon's breath firecrackers, lay scattered near Leo's motionless wheelchair. Several had clearly been shoved directly under the seat. Leo was rigid with terror, his small hands clamped over his ears, tears streaming down his face, his body shuddering with each popping aftershock from the firecrackers that had already detonated. The acrid smell of gunpowder and burnt paper filled the air, a miniature battlefield superimposed on a perfectly manicured lawn. "What in God's name are you doing?" Marcus's voice was a low growl, the parade ground command of it cutting through Brenda Hatcher's triumphant haze. She whirled, startled, her carefully coiffed blonde hair barely moving. Seeing Marcus, a relative newcomer she'd only seen in passing, her expression morphed from vicious satisfaction to affronted indignation. "Stay out of this. This is none of your concern. This little nuisance," she spat the word, gesturing contemptuously at the sobbing child, "has been disturbing the peace all day with his racket. I was just encouraging him to play somewhere else. Somewhere quieter. Encouraging him." Marcus repeated, his voice dangerously soft, as he moved closer, his gaze sweeping over the terrified child, the spent firecrackers, the live ones, still perilously close to the wheelchair's mechanisms. "You call terrorizing a disabled child encouragement?" His mind, trained to analyze threats, was already cataloging the scene: assault, reckless endangerment, malicious intent. The fact that the victim was a child in a wheelchair amplified the depravity tenfold. Brenda Hatcher drew herself up. He shouldn't be allowed to make such a commotion in a residential area. There are rules, standards. Some of us value peace and quiet. She seemed utterly devoid of remorse, her eyes hard and unapologetic. Marcus knelt beside Leo, his voice gentle. "Leo, are you okay? Are you hurt?" Leo could only shake his head, his eyes wide with a terror that Marcus recognized from victims of far more sophisticated cruelties. The boy's mother, Sarah Callahan, burst from the front door, her face a mask of panic. "Leo, oh my God, what happened?" She rushed to her son, her eyes finding the firecrackers, then Brenda Hatcher. A look of horrified understanding, quickly followed by fierce maternal rage, crossed her features. "Brenda, what did you do?" "I merely provided a little incentive for him to be more considerate," Brenda said, her tone laced with a chilling self-righteousness. Marcus stood, placing himself between Brenda and the Callahans. His off-duty attire, jeans and a plain t-shirt, gave no hint of his profession, but the steel in his spine, the unwavering intensity of his gaze, was something Brenda Hatcher, in her cocoon of suburban entitlement, had likely never encountered. "You assaulted a child, Ms. Hatcher, a disabled child. That's not incentive. That's a felony." The words were flat, unequivocal. This wasn't a neighborhood spat. This was something else entirely. And Brenda Hatcher had no idea who she had just crossed. Marcus Thorne was the chief of the Special Offenses Unit within the Department of Homeland Security. His world was one of classified briefings, intricate investigations into domestic extremism, sophisticated cybercrimes, and threats that rarely made the evening news, but had the potential to unravel the fabric of national stability. He navigated a labyrinth of federal statutes, interagency task forces, and the constant gnawing pressure of anticipating the unthinkable. His team was elite hand-picked, accustomed to dealing with individuals and groups driven by ideologies of hate, paranoia, and violence. His mind was a finely tuned instrument, dissecting motives, identifying vulnerabilities, and building cases designed to withstand the most rigorous legal scrutiny. He'd come to Meadowbrook Creek, a leafy enclave of comfortable homes and aspiring middle-class dreams, to spend a rare week of leave with his sister Clara, her husband Tom, and his two boisterous nieces. Clara worried about him, about the toll his job took. She'd hoped the relentless normalcy of suburban life, barbecues, trips to the park, the gentle rhythm of sprinklers on summer lawns, would offer him a genuine respite. He too had craved that illusion of peace, a temporary reprieve from the grim realities he confronted daily. Leo Callahan and his mother Sarah lived 3 doors down from Clara. Marcus had met them a few times. Leo was a spirited kid, his laughter infectious, his blue wheelchair often adorned with superhero stickers. He loved to play in his front yard, his delighted shouts a common sound in the afternoons as he zoomed his chair up and down the driveway or engaged in imaginary adventures. Sarah was a single mother, a graphic designer who worked from home, her devotion to Leo evident in every interaction. She was friendly but reserved, navigating the often unseen challenges of raising a child with disabilities with quiet grace. Brenda Hatcher was a more recent arrival to Meadowbrook Creek, having bought the house directly opposite the Callahans about 6 months prior. She was a widow in her late 50s, immaculately presented, with an air of perpetual dissatisfaction. She'd quickly made her presence felt on the HOA board, her pronouncements on community standards and property values delivered with an iron will and a thinly veiled contempt for anyone who didn't meet her exacting and often arbitrary expectations. Clara had mentioned Brenda's numerous complaints about the color of a neighbor's mailbox, the height of someone's grass, and pointedly the noise levels emanating from the Callahan yard during Leo's playtime. "She gives me the creeps," Clara had confided. "There's something really cold about her." The inciting incident, Brenda's calculated cruelty with the Firecrackers, shattered Marcus's carefully constructed illusion of an ordinary Saturday. It wasn't just a momentary lapse of judgment, a cruel prank gone wrong. The deliberate placement of the explosives under the wheelchair, the chillingly calm justification, spoke of a deeper, more disturbing malice. As he stood there, shielding Leo and Sarah, his professional instincts kicked in with full force. This wasn't just a job for local law enforcement. This had the hallmarks of something that could, and perhaps should, fall under a much broader and more serious investigative lens, especially given the victim's vulnerability. Sarah was now kneeling by Leo, murmuring soothing words, her hands gently checking him for burns. Thankfully, apart from sheer terror, he seemed physically unscathed, though a small, angry red mark was visible on his calf, where a piece of a firecracker casing had apparently struck him. "I'm calling the police," Sarah said, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury as she reached for her phone. "Good," Marcus affirmed. He looked directly at Brenda Hatcher, who was now attempting to gather her composure, a sneer replacing her initial shock. "Go ahead," Brenda said, fluffing her hair. "They'll see it was just a misunderstanding. Boys will be boys after all. He was making an awful racket. Someone had to teach him a lesson about consideration for others." Her attempt to normalize her actions to equate setting off explosives under a disabled child's wheelchair with some sort of acceptable disciplinary measure was grotesque. The local police, 2 young officers named Miller and Davies, arrived within 10 minutes. Their expressions were initially one of weary resignation, likely expecting a typical neighborhood dispute. Brenda Hatcher immediately launched into her version of events, portraying herself as a concerned citizen, trying to maintain neighborhood decorum, downplaying the Firecrackers as a few harmless pops, and Leo as an unruly child, whose mother was overly sensitive. Marcus listened, his anger a cold, controlled burn. He then calmly, precisely recounted what he had witnessed Brenda Hatcher deliberately lighting and placing multiple firecrackers directly beneath Leo Callahan's occupied wheelchair, her stated intent to scare him off. He pointed out the remaining unexploded firecrackers, the burn marks on the pavement, and Leo's obvious terror. Officer Miller, the senior of the two, frowned his gaze, shifting from Brenda's dismissive posture to Leo's tear-streaked face, then to Marcus's quiet but authoritative presence. "Ma'am," he said to Brenda, "setting off fireworks in this manner, especially directed at a child, is a serious offense. It's assault." Brenda scoffed. assault with a few party poppers. Don't be ridiculous. He wasn't hurt. It was just to get his attention. This man, she gestured towards Marcus, is exaggerating. He's new here, probably doesn't understand how things work in Meadowbrook. Sarah, holding a still trembling Leo, interjected, he has a burn mark on his leg, officer, and he's terrified. This wasn't getting his attention. This was a malicious attack. The officers took statements. Marcus provided his full name and Clara's address as his temporary residence, deliberately omitting his professional title for the moment. He wanted to see how the local system would handle this before revealing his hand. He observed as Officer Davies collected the remaining firecrackers and took photos of the scene. Brenda Hatcher was issued a citation for unlawful discharge of fireworks and a stern warning, but she was not arrested, much to Sarah's visible distress and Marcus's carefully concealed frustration. The officers explained that without more severe visible injuries and with Brenda's denial of intent to cause physical harm, they were limited in their immediate actions, but a report would be filed with Child Protective Services and the DA's office for review. As the police car pulled away, Brenda Hatcher shot a look of pure, unadulterated triumph towards Sarah and Marcus. You see, her smirk seemed to say, nothing. She then turned and strode back into her house, the picture of smug impunity. That's it, Sarah whispered, her voice laced with disbelief and despair. A ticket for what she did to my son. Marcus met her gaze. No, Sarah, he said, his voice firm. That's not it. This is just the beginning. The rising action began almost immediately, fueled by Brenda Hatcher's arrogance and a chilling lack of empathy that bordered on sociopathic. The first shockwave came not from further direct attacks, but from the insidious way the neighborhood power structure, the HOA, responded. Brenda, a prominent and vocal member of the HOA board's Aesthetics and Harmony Committee, wasted no time in spinning her narrative. Within days, Sarah received a delicately worded but deeply unsettling letter from the Meadowbrook Creek Homeowners Association. It expressed regret over the unfortunate incident and acknowledged the distress experienced by young Leo. However, the letter quickly pivoted, suggesting that, in the interest of maintaining community tranquility and preventing future misunderstandings, Mrs. Callahan might consider supervising Leo's outdoor play more closely, or finding alternative, perhaps quieter, recreational activities for him. It was a masterpiece of victim blaming, subtly implying that Leo's presence, his normal childhood sounds, were the root cause of the conflict. There was no condemnation of Brenda's actions, no offer of support for Leo. Sarah was devastated. They're blaming him, Marcus. They're blaming my son for being assaulted. She showed him the letter, her hands shaking. Marcus read it, his jaw tightening. This was the systemic rot that often allowed bullies like Brenda to thrive. The HOA, more concerned with avoiding controversy and maintaining a facade of peaceful conformity, was effectively sanctioning Brenda's behavior by shifting the onus onto the victim. This is unacceptable, he said. She's using the HOA to further harass you. He advised Sarah to document everything, to keep the letter to note any further interactions with Brenda or the HOA. He also started making some discreet inquiries of his own, leveraging resources that were definitely not available to the average concerned neighbor. He wanted to understand Brenda Hatcher better, to see if this was an isolated act of cruelty or part of a pattern. The second shocking incident unfolded over the following week, demonstrating Brenda's escalating campaign of intimidation. She didn't use firecrackers again, but her methods became more psychologically insidious. She began a pattern of blatant surveillance. Whenever Leo was in his front yard, Brenda would appear on her porch or by her front window, just watching her gaze cold and unwavering. Sometimes she'd make notes on a clipboard. Other times, she'd ostentatiously film Leo with her phone. The message was clear: I am watching you. You are not welcome. Leo, already traumatized, became withdrawn and fearful. He stopped asking to play outside. His bright laughter, once a common sound, was silenced. He started having nightmares. Sarah felt like a prisoner in her own home, her anxiety a constant thrumming presence. Then came the anonymous complaints. Child Protective Services received a call alleging that Leo was being neglected, left unsupervised for long periods. Animal Control got a complaint about excessive barking from a dog the Callahans didn't own. The town's code enforcement office received an email about supposed unpermitted modifications to their property. Each complaint was investigated and found to be baseless, but the process was invasive, stressful, and clearly designed to harass and destabilize Sarah. Brenda never directly admitted to making these calls, but the timing, the nature of the complaints, and the smug satisfaction that radiated from her whenever Sarah looked her way left little doubt as to their origin. She was weaponizing bureaucracy, turning community systems into instruments of torment. She also started trying to turn other neighbors against the Callahans, spreading subtle rumors about Leo being difficult or Sarah being uncooperative. She spoke of protecting property values from disruptive elements. Marcus witnessed all of this, his anger building with each new act of calculated cruelty. He was gathering information, building a timeline, noting Brenda's patterns. He knew that her actions, while individually perhaps designed to seem like petty annoyances, collectively painted a picture of a targeted, malicious campaign of harassment against a vulnerable child and his mother motivated by prejudice against Leo's disability and his very presence. The term hate crime was beginning to form in his mind, though he knew state laws regarding HOA abuse and disability were often murky. The midpoint twist began to unfurl during a tense impromptu gathering on Clara's lawn. Brenda had organized a small group of her sympathetic neighbors, mostly older residents who valued quiet above all else and were easily swayed by her pronouncements on standards for what she called a community harmony discussion. It was clearly an attempt to publicly pressure Sarah and, by extension, isolate her. Marcus, Clara, and Tom were present standing with Sarah, who looked pale but resolute. Brenda, holding a sheaf of papers she claimed were documented disturbances, began her diatribe. "We all want Meadowbrook Creek to be a peaceful, desirable place to live." She started her voice smooth and reasonable, a stark contrast to her private venom. "And that requires a certain level of consideration from all residents. Unfortunately, some households have not been mindful of their impact on their neighbors." She didn't name Leo directly, but her implications were crystal clear. "Are you referring to my son Brenda?" Sarah interjected, her voice shaking but firm. "A child playing in his own yard." "I am referring to persistent disruptive noise and a lack of parental oversight that affects the quality of life for everyone." Brenda retorted, her eyes glinting. "Some of us are retired. Some of us work from home. We deserve tranquility." One of Brenda's allies, a woman named Mrs. Henderson, chimed in, "My Harold needs his rest. All that shouting. It's very stressful." It was then that Marcus decided the time for quiet observation was over. The local response had been inadequate. The HOA was complicit. Sarah and Leo were being systematically tormented. Brenda Hatcher was operating with a sense of impunity that needed to be shattered. He stepped forward, his demeanor shifting subtly. The affable visitor was gone, replaced by something harder, more formidable. "Ms. Hatcher." He began, his voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight. "Your campaign of harassment against Leo Callahan and his mother is not about community harmony. It's about prejudice and malice, and it stops now." Brenda laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Harassment. Who do you think you are, barging in and making accusations? You don't even live here permanently. You have no standing." "Oh, I think I have standing." Marcus said, his eyes locking onto hers. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out his wallet. Not the one with his driver's license and credit cards. This was the one that identified him to the most powerful echelons of federal law enforcement. He flipped it open, revealing the gleaming gold shield and the stark, unambiguous credentials. "Brenda Hatcher, I am Marcus Thorne, Chief of the Special Offenses Unit Department of Homeland Security. What you did to Leo Callahan with those firecrackers was felony assault on a protected individual. Your subsequent actions, the surveillance, the false reports, the organized intimidation, constitute a pattern of targeted harassment and potentially fall under federal hate crime statutes, given Leo's disability. You are, as of this moment, the subject of a federal investigation." A stunned silence fell over the small gathering. Brenda Hatcher's face went from smug derision to slack-jawed disbelief. The color drained from her cheeks. Her allies looked confused and alarmed. Clara and Tom exchanged wide-eyed glances. Sarah stared at Marcus, a flicker of dawning hope in her eyes. Homeland Security. Brenda finally choked out her voice, a caricature of her earlier confidence. For a neighborhood dispute? You're bluffing. You can't possibly be..." The second layer of the twist began to emerge as Marcus's team, working with a quiet efficiency that was terrifying in its implications, for Brenda, started to dig. They weren't just looking at her actions in Meadowbrook Creek. They were looking at her entire life, her digital footprint, her past associations. And what they found was far more sinister than a mere neighborhood bully. Brenda Hatcher, it turned out, was not just a casually cruel individual. She was an active participant, indeed, a moderator for several obscure but virulent online forums and social media groups dedicated to promoting ideologies of community purity and traditional values. These groups, while couched in euphemisms, were rife with thinly veiled hatred towards minorities, immigrants, and with particular vehemence, disabled individuals whom they often referred to as drains on society or aberrations. Brenda, under various pseudonyms, had authored numerous posts and articles advocating for reclaiming neighborhoods from undesirable elements. She shared strategies for making communities uncomfortable for those she deemed unfit strategies that included coordinated harassment leveraging HOA rules and instigating official complaints. The Firecracker incident, while perhaps more brazen than her usual online exhortations, was entirely consistent with the hateful rhetoric she espoused and encouraged in others. They even found evidence that she had coached others in similar harassment campaigns in previous neighborhoods where she had lived, using HOAs as her cudgel. She saw herself as a righteous crusader, cleansing communities of those who didn't meet her twisted standards. This discovery transformed the case. This wasn't just about one woman's personal vendetta against a child. This was about an ideologically motivated campaign of hate, with Brenda Hatcher as a key instigator and participant. The Special Offenses Unit was precisely the right agency to handle this. Her actions against Leo were not an isolated outburst. They were a manifestation of a deeply ingrained organized prejudice. The climax arrived not at a chaotic town hall, but in the sterile, formal setting of a federal courtroom for Brenda Hatcher's arraignment, following her arrest by federal agents at her home a week after Marcus's public revelation. The arrest itself had been quiet, professional, and utterly devoid of the drama Brenda might have expected or even craved. She was simply a suspect being taken into custody. The charges were read: felony assault on a minor aggravated assault due to the victim's disability, witness intimidation, and significantly federal charges relating to conspiracy to interfere with civil rights, given her online activities and the evidence of a broader pattern of ideologically motivated harassment. The prosecution, led by an assistant U.S. attorney working closely with Marcus's unit, laid out the initial evidence, painting a chilling picture of Brenda's calculated cruelty and her deeply rooted bigotry. Brenda, dressed in a drab jumpsuit, looked small and diminished, without her usual trappings of suburban authority. Her expensive lawyer attempted to argue for low bail, portraying her as a respected community member with no prior record who had simply made a regrettable error in judgment with some harmless fireworks. It was then that Marcus Thorne, though not a prosecutor, was permitted by the judge to provide a brief statement regarding the ongoing national security implications of the case, given his unit's involvement and the nature of Brenda's wider activities. He spoke calmly, his words precise and devastating. He outlined, without revealing sensitive investigative details, the scope of Brenda's involvement in online networks promoting hate and discrimination, linking her actions against Leo directly to this broader, more insidious agenda. He spoke of the particular vulnerability of disabled individuals to such targeted harassment and the federal government's commitment to protecting their civil rights. "This was not an error in judgment, Your Honor." Marcus concluded, his gaze steady. "This was a calculated act of terror against a child born of a hateful ideology that seeks to exclude and silence the vulnerable. Ms. Hatcher is not merely a neighborhood nuisance. She is an active proponent of a doctrine that poses a significant threat to community safety and cohesion. Her actions against Leo Callahan were a direct translation of that ideology into violence." The judge, a stern, experienced jurist, listened intently. When Marcus finished, the courtroom was silent. Brenda Hatcher's lawyer looked visibly shaken. Bail was denied. Brenda Hatcher was deemed a flight risk and a potential ongoing danger to the community, specifically to the Callahan family. She was remanded into custody. Sarah Callahan was in the courtroom holding Leo's hand tightly. As Brenda was led away, Sarah met Marcus's eyes, a look of profound, tearful gratitude passing between them. Leo, though still subdued, managed a small, shy smile at Marcus. The falling action moved with a momentum of its own. Brenda Hatcher's case became a flashpoint. The involvement of Homeland Security, the heinous nature of the crime against a disabled child, and the exposure of her online hate network drew national media attention. Disability advocacy groups rallied, demanding justice for Leo and calling for stronger legal protections against the kind of HOA-abetted harassment Brenda had perfected. The legal consequences for Brenda were severe. Faced with the overwhelming evidence meticulously compiled by Marcus's team, her online writings, testimony from past victims and other communities whom investigators had tracked down, forensic analysis of her devices, and the unwavering testimony of Marcus and Sarah, her defense crumbled. She was convicted on multiple felony counts. The judge in sentencing delivered a scathing rebuke of her actions and her hateful ideology, emphasizing the profound betrayal of community trust and the lasting trauma inflicted on Leo. Brenda received a lengthy federal prison sentence. Her assets, some of which were found to be linked to the funding of her online hate platforms, were seized. The legislative change spurred by the case was equally significant. Marcus Thorne, leveraging his position and the national spotlight on the Callahan case, worked with a bipartisan group of state legislators to draft and champion new legislation. Dubbed Leo's Law, it aimed to amend existing state hate crime statutes to explicitly include harassment and abuse perpetrated through or by members of homeowners associations when motivated by prejudice against protected characteristics such as disability, race, religion, or sexual orientation. Marcus testified before legislative committees presenting the Hatcher case as a stark example of how HOAs, designed to manage common property, could be twisted into instruments of oppression. He argued that the power wielded by HOAs, including the ability to levy fines, impose restrictions, and influence residents' daily lives, required greater accountability, especially when that power was abused to target vulnerable individuals. Sarah Callahan also testified her quiet dignity and her fierce love for her son, moving many of committee members to tears as she described the terror and isolation they had endured. Leo's Law faced some opposition from HOA lobbying groups concerned about overreach, but public sentiment, fueled by the horrifying details of Brenda's actions, was overwhelmingly in favor. The law passed, creating a new legal standard for accountability and providing clear avenues for victims of HOA-driven hate to seek justice and protection. It set a precedent that other states began to examine. In Meadowbrook Creek, the HOA was thrown into turmoil. Several board members, tainted by their association with Brenda and their initial dismissive response to Sarah, resigned. A new board was elected, one that included Clara Marcus's sister, who was determined to ensure that their community lived up to its welcoming facade. They swiftly implemented mandatory anti-discrimination training for all board members and committee volunteers. They revised bylaws to include explicit protections for residents with disabilities and established a clear independent grievance process for harassment claims. The community rallied around Leo and Sarah in a way that was both heartwarming and a little overwhelming. There were apologies, offers of help, and gestures of solidarity. A neighborhood fundraiser was organized not for the Callahans financially, but to create a new, fully accessible playground in the local park named Leo's Friendship Park. The dark cloud of Brenda Hatcher's malice slowly began to lift, replaced by a renewed sense of neighborliness and a collective commitment to inclusivity. Leo, with therapy and the unwavering support of his mother and the community, began to heal. His laughter gradually returned to the Callahan yard. He started playing outside again, cautiously at first, then with growing confidence. The superhero stickers on his blue wheelchair seemed brighter than ever. Marcus Thorne returned to his demanding job at Homeland Security, the suburban interlude having become one of the most impactful cases of his recent career. It was a stark reminder that threats to safety and security didn't always come from shadowy international organizations or heavily armed extremists. Sometimes they festered in manicured lawns and quiet cul-de-sacs fueled by everyday prejudice and the abuse of petty power. He knew that for every Brenda Hatcher, his unit publicly dismantled, there were countless others operating in the shadows online and in communities. He maintained contact with Sarah and Leo, checking in periodically. He attended the dedication of Leo's Friendship Park, standing quietly at the back, watching Leo surrounded by other children, joyfully navigating the new accessible equipment. The sound of their laughter was a balm, a counterpoint to the ugly echoes of Brenda Hatcher's hate. The case had left an indelible mark. It had affirmed his belief in the critical importance of vigilance against all forms of hate, no matter how seemingly localized. It had demonstrated the profound impact that one person's courage to intervene, coupled with the robust application of law, could have in protecting the vulnerable and effecting systemic change. The weight of his knowing, the burden of the darkness he confronted daily, was lightened by such victories, by the tangible evidence that justice, though sometimes slow and hard-won, could prevail. Leo's laughter echoing across the new playground was a powerful testament to that truth, a resilient melody of hope that resonated far beyond the quiet streets of Meadowbrook Creek. The Firecrackers had been meant to silence and scare. Instead, they had ignited a movement towards greater understanding, stronger protections, and a community more deeply committed to the simple yet profound ideal that everyone belonged.